marketing to developers. Thanks, Justin. Thank you. So I've heard this is the main event. Maybe. So yeah, if you want a seat for the main event, that's something I can advise. Yeah, pretty excited. So this is like the marketing topic, I think, in crypto where it's kind of very different to all the other ones. You know, like airdrops, Twitter, like everybody feels like they understand that. And then I think developer marketing is the sort of like outlier of like, okay, how do we do that? Like no one really seems to know unless you've actually worked, within an ecosystem or you happen to do DevRel before. I think, dev marketing is definitely a different beast. So, I've done a fair bit of this with Hype. We actually offer that as a service. We've worked with a lot of protocols, learned some things along the way, but I think you two maybe know more than I do. So excited to ask you some questions. So to kick off, we'll just do intros. So I'm Jake. I'm the founder of Hype. Probably talked about it. We're co-sponsoring this event. We do a lot of developer marketing, DevRel type stuff with projects. So, if you two want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Charlie. I'm the CMO over at Nillion. Yeah.
Sorry. I did turn this. Oh, shoot. I'll just take this. All right, we'll use this one. Hey, everyone. My name is Jay. I'm the CMO at Eco. I was most recently head of marketing at Avalanche, and before that, was leading marketing for a DEX called AirSwap. So I've been in space for a while. For all of my endeavors in crypto, it's been very dev-focused, I would say. So excited to talk about some of the things we did in the past.
Cool. Wow, it's loud. Okay, so I think we can kind of like dive straight into it. So I think with developer marketing, we'll maybe start at the beginning. So I think a lot of protocols are looking for developers. This is like a very common thing when people come to us. Where do you start? Like, where do you, if you're a project, you need developers to come build on your protocol or stack or whatever it might be, where do people start with that?
I think the first thing I would do is just talk to 100 developers. Talk to 100 people that you think are your customer segment to really understand who they are. We're all clearly not developers, so we can only know so much about that customer base. We can assume a lot of things, and we can probably be certain about those assumptions to some degree, but I think it is a different flavor of an audience segment. So if you pick traditional tech, for example, and their developer strategy, I think there's merit to using their playbooks, but I think you just need to revise them for your target audience segment. And once you know that, then it's really all about figuring out what your media mix is, what your funnels look like, how do you actually implement and execute those activations and those campaigns, and then you just test and iterate. I think where people jump the gun is they actually don't do that customer discovery phase, and they just assume a lot of things, and they try activations and they don't work, or they don't have a proper funnel, and so therefore it's just activations for activation's sake. And then you have growth in certain channels, but not actual conversions or success measures on the product side. And ultimately, what are we doing in marketing? We're trying to enable, accelerate the progress towards your product and business goals. And so I feel like that's really like a critical step that I find that a lot of crypto projects overlook, at least at this time.
Yeah, and then just kind of building on that, one of the, if you're not a founder and you're not technical and you've been tasked with actually bringing in developers, a lot of people don't actually know what channels for them to find them on. They think that they can just go to, Twitter and run the same kind of shill tactics that they would for like a more retail audience. But that's not how developers really respond. You need to go to different channels. Like you said, once you have spoken to your first 100 developers, once you have started to get like a quick start guide out there or some SDKs, spend time in things like GitHub discussions, spend time in like developer DAO. Where are they actually living? Where are they? And then go and speak to as many of them as possible in environments that they're comfortable with, environments where it's not marketing language, where it's not, do X, get Y. It's finding out what are the problems that you have in your tech, and how you can improve them. How can you improve your tooling? How can you do those things? But it's all about initially knowing what channels do they actually live in, and how can you position your DevRels or your marketers around those channels to be able to communicate effectively with them there.
Yeah, and just adding to that, like I think you mentioned like talk to the first 100 developers. Yeah, I think where I speak to founders who are doing this, so whether it be like a L1 or L2 or something like that, there's a big disparity between expectations and like reality. So I mean, I've learned this over the years that like, you know, if you're going for a community, like a traditional like retail community, yeah, I mean, like they're not all going to be real, but people want like 10,000, 50,000, whatever the number is, right? And that's sort of the expectation with all these kind of like airdrop farming type things. Like you get tens of thousands of accounts, not people necessarily, in a community. And then the expectation is like, okay, cool. Like maybe we can get thousands of developers, you know, like that seems like a reasonable number. Like let's, you know, like big Web2 companies, open source companies, you know, they have thousands of developers. So like we want thousands of developers, or Ethereum has that. And it's just so far from like what's possible in reality as a new project, right? If you are EVM, then yeah, there's a big pool of Solidity developers now. But if you have a custom tech stack or like a new language, yeah, the numbers you're actually looking at are probably like 100 and less. And that's one of the things that I think I've found from doing this work is like the expectations are we want 1,000 active developers building, you know, dApps or on our protocol. And honestly, it's just that's 5 years away maybe, or, you know, if you are like something specialized, and getting 50 is probably like the goal for the next 6 months, like 50 active people or X amount of, you know, small amount of projects building. Like that's where you should be aiming in the beginning. And yeah, like people then are like, well, that doesn't seem good enough, or like, how are we going to get anywhere? But it's just realistic. And I think one place to look for that is the Electric Capital Developer Report. They do one every year. Like it's like the best report on like crypto developer communities. And when you look at like how many people are actually building on protocols, right? Take Ethereum out and Solana. When you start to get to stuff that's still fairly big, like Near, like Avalanche, you know, like big projects we've all heard of, the amount of active developers in those communities is much lower than, you know, what some people think, you know, but it's still impressive. So yeah, that's kind of how I also, yeah, just be realistic about your expectations, because we're all more on the marketing side, and like we're the ones who always get in trouble when we don't get thousands of developers. At least that's what I find. But yeah, and you know, tagging onto that, like, what have you guys seen, like in all your experiences? Like, what are some of the like the quick wins, or the things that actually work? Because as you said, it's really easy to throw money away on developer marketing. Like, is there anything that you think like that's actually really high value?
I feel like for me, I think there's like a base level strategy that I think everyone's kind of using to some degree that everyone agrees is pretty effective. It's kind of the standard strategy, like multi-channel digital marketing, social, intertwined with community channels, and bringing down the funnel down to like a forum or whatever it is, right? But I think the question that helps me the most, and I think I encourage my teams to ask is this actually the way we need to do it? Or can we do it? Can we be very kind of counter to the trend? And that's more of just like a tool and device to use to really like test whether or not you can actually squeeze out a creative outcome for it. A good example is, and there's nothing wrong with this per se, but in swag, right? Most people gravitate towards a shirt, bag, sweater, some combination of the three. But if you actually shine through and go towards something that's useful, or you actually go towards something that stands out and is much more relevant to the audience, it actually might stand out a little bit more. And now that's like a very basic example, but you could do that with any type of strategy. If you have a campaign when you're doing co-marketing and you're saying, hey, should we be doing the 2 logo thing that everybody does, or should we do something else? And for those that actually take that risk, if they tend to think through the strategy and actually see the line forward, they actually reap much more ROI on that activation because no one else is doing it. And so I feel like the last 3-5 years of our industry, we're seeing a lot more marketers take risk, which I love, myself included. And so I feel like it's that, like, should we be doing this type thinking that I think a lot of people are starting to adopt a little bit more. And then that's where you're kind of seeing a lot of these new ideas come into online or wherever the activation exists.
Yeah. So I think we'll take a baseline assumption that you have like at least an SDK and a quick start guide if you're a project. So let's just take those base assumptions. Yeah, there's kind of two paths that you can go down right now that are kind of like the trad paths, we'll say. You can spend like tens of thousands of dollars on hackathons and like hope that like 30 people build on you. Or, you can create like, and I think Chainlink does this best, where they just create like a shitload of content about it and do like tutorials and guides and demos. That's really great. But everyone's doing that, and you have a different kind of saturation when you do that. It's just developer saturation. But I think what is interesting is to look at like where that underpriced attention might be. And one of the things that we've been doing is that, when we release like a new product or a new tooling set, is going to like the Ivy League blockchain school groups. And you can pay like $100 in pizza and spend like an hour and a half and get 50 graduate students from Harvard to do some work. And like, you can replicate that 10 times and it costs you $1,000 in pizza, but you have more brand awareness at the graduate level. You have a lot more feedback on the tooling that you're releasing or the product that you're releasing. And it's this really underpriced attention because you're not growing vertically. You're not growing in like follower numbers, but you're growing horizontally across like their group chats and those areas. And that's that really kind of underpriced attention that you can do. And you can obviously capture content from that. You can record workshops and do all that kind of stuff. That's great. But if you try and look at where are the developers actually? And like you said, there's only so many developers that are actively building in crypto right now. Do you provide the incentives to remove them from their ecosystems? If you're new, probably not. But where are the people that haven't yet chosen ecosystem? Where do they live? What are they doing right now? What can you offer them? And normally there's a lot lower cost of entry for that. And you can provide a lot more value upfront for them, and you can get a lot more feedback as a project really quickly. And we found that's been really effective for us. So yeah, that's kind of where we lean to, is like, how do we go to the grassroots level to really kind of grow things from there?
Yeah, cool. And I think actually there's an article I read years ago, that's exactly what MongoDB did. And there's a really good article about like how MongoDB became, a database provider. I mean, I'm a marketer, I'm not sure exactly what MongoDB is, but they grew it through doing these pizza nights, colleges across the US, and then blowing up from there. And I think, to tag on to that as well, is like, there's different numbers thrown around, like what does it cost? What's your, cost of acquisition for a developer? Like if you're going after like crypto native developers, like there's, different numbers, but they're big numbers that are thrown around. And if you go for, the college dev who just kind of, has no money and likes pizza, it can be $10 or something, at least to get them interested. And I think another thing, we did some campaigns like years ago with like Cello, when they were looking at like what they want to do. And Cello has a very like global approach, I would say. They're very much like, let's find people like all over the world and get them building like useful things for like wherever they are. And I think that's the one thing with crypto sometimes as well, is like you get warped by like the numbers being thrown around. So, $1 billion protocols, fundraisers of 50 or 100 million or crazy stuff like that. And the reality is, there's a student dev or maybe just a dev somewhere else in the world who's like, cool, like you're going to pay me $200 to like build this thing out. Like, awesome. Like I'm in. And that's raw talent that you basically can't buy. You can't get like an experienced crypto native dev to do anything for $200 these days. Or if there is any that then like send them my way. But it's really difficult. Like I think within crypto, like people have been very warped by money, and it's best to almost sometimes find. And there's a bigger pool as well. There's supposedly 50 million devs in the world. And there's only X amount that are in this space. And so that actually is quite a good lead on to my next thought. What are your thoughts on grants programs like giving out grants to projects or devs, or I guess you can include hackathons in that. Like essentially, I think projects in the space use money. Like, oh, we've got money. Like, let's give money to devs. Does it work? Is there a good way to do it? Like, the good and the bad.
Yeah, so the way we look at hackathons, like large hackathons, like the ETH Global ones, for example, it's less about acquisition of devs and it's more just brand awareness to devs, especially if you're a new project. Like being part of one of those hackathons is actually really good for your brand awareness because you do get to speak to a lot of people. You do get to give away, merch and all those things, which is great. But we don't view it as this is our cost of acquisition for devs, because it would be like $3,000 a dev, and that's just so expensive. But in terms of like grants and those kind of things, sometimes they work. A lot of the time they're extremely unstructured and they don't have a lot of milestones to, you've got to complete X to be able to get Y. A lot of the time it's just upfront. I like some of the retroactive grants, but I've really been enjoying, I don't know if it's massively new, but I've been enjoying it recently, which is kind of like what Monad and those kind of projects have been doing, where it's much more of like a Shark Tank environment, in which they're not actually putting up a lot of their own money. They're bringing in projects that invested in them as a project and putting together a pool of money from, I don't know, from like Pantera or A16Z or something like that. They'll put together a pool of money and they're essentially using their liquidity providers to fund their ecosystem as well. Everybody wins from that, Monad, the liquidity providers, and the projects in their ecosystem. So I think that's a really actually good way, because it's promoting not just doing like a weekend hack, but actually building projects, and they're normally relatively consumer-facing projects, which we obviously have a huge lack of in this space. So I've really been enjoying watching those kind of hackathons / grants / Dragon's Den style events that have been unfolding. And I really actually hope that we see a lot more of them and less of the kind of unstructured, here's a pot of money that we're going to divide up at the end of the weekend no matter what, and move towards much more of a structured approach.
When I think back to grants and just like companies, foundations giving capital to projects, I think back to early days of Avalanche when I joined in 2020. I was part of the team that built up the grants program and then the investment program that followed suit. To be honest, I would love to say that we had a full plan and actual intention to how we actually approach this, but we really didn't. And I'll tell you kind of what we learned from that experience. We started to deploy grants. Why? Because everybody else was doing it. That was the simple reason. What happens is when you look back, where do grants really come from in our industry? I think you can kind of date it back to like the early Ethereum Foundation, a little bit of Consensus. They were actually started as a venture studios model because they thought, hey, let's actually start to grow this share while also having some sort of stake in the companies that deploy them. I think they scaled too fast at the time, and so they kind of stumbled a little bit, and then grants kind of got squeezed in there. So the playbook was uncertain for sure, and then maybe it's a little bit more uncertain, or it's still fairly uncertain now. But where I think we matured a little bit, and this is kind of how we shaped our program, is grants felt less qualified, or was more for like the less qualified dev target audience, effectively. These check sizes are like in 5-figure range, maybe 6. It might be more of like a, hey, we'll help you kind of get you accelerated, but there's really no strings attached. And if you have a foundation that's well capitalized, maybe that's not a big deal. Now, where we started to shift our focus, and this is where probably 90% of our efforts, BD, ecosystem marketing, all those things we're focused on, was the investment side. The investment side made much more sense, probably because it seemed more familiar. It exists almost in any other industry. Grants do too, effectively, but I would say more prominently, I think the investment side does. And where we actually matured a little bit more beyond the grants is we actually could structure it much better. How do we actually qualify these leads? What do you have to do to actually get those investments? If you actually get an investment, what are the different milestones that we have to structure, just like if we were a typical VC? We also can figure out lead strategies, follow-ons, all the rest of the stuff that traditional VCs do. At the end of the day, then we can start to have a seat at the table at that in that kind of subsector of the market. And that's really where we started to find our stride, because then we're basically running a VC model where we're allocating some portion of our fund, the funds that we've raised, to actually start taking a little bit more risk, but also calculated risk to grow out the ecosystem. I think the biggest challenge across all these things was scale. How do you actually scale without making the venture side your primary offering when, at Avalanche, we were focused on deploying applications or helping people deploy applications on chain. Our primary business was in venture capital. So I feel like that's kind of where we left it off. I would love to see a little bit more structure on the grant side. Maybe I'm just not privy to some of the stuff that's happening there. But I feel like I'm aired towards more structure, so then both parties can win and everyone kind of sees eye to eye on exactly what those goals are. And I think at the end of the day, the company that we're all working for probably has some sort of stake in the upside. I feel like that's very important as well long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think with grants, yeah, there was this era like 2019, 2020 where like people were like, okay, we don't know what to do, but we've got loads of money or loads of tokens, so like let's just create these $100 million grants programs. And basically everybody announced one at one point, probably also you guys. And then it sort of didn't make sense. Like even the uptake of it, like people would have $100 million to give away, but then people didn't even dish out $100 million. It's sort of, yeah, I think you create like bad incentives. So that was from working with, I remember working with Algorand at that time, and they kind of had a similar thing. Like they had infinite money, it felt, to give away, but like even then it wasn't like everybody was jumping on the chance to kind of like deploy. So then you had to come up with a new plan. And I think stuff I've seen recently, like in the last couple of years, that is working mostly better. I know like Optimism, like the way they do their grants program is they don't really give away. There's obviously got different incentives as part of their retro funding, but for their pure grants that they do, they have like milestones that have to be reached, and then generally the team gets nothing, right? So it's not like, hey, if you're successful, we'll kind of like pay you out, which is sometimes how grants worked in the past, which was like bad incentive alignment maybe. But now you only get the grant to use for user acquisition, for example. So it's like, we'll give you, I don't know, they don't know if they give $1 million, but let's say they give $1 million, but it's got to be all used for user incentives. And that's really good because it helps the project kind of bootstrap and, get their first users or whatever it might be. But it doesn't, it isn't money that's then just kind of like siphoned off by founders or, anything else that could happen. So I think that's kind of makes sense. And then obviously having different milestones, if you get to 10 million TVL, then you unlock another tranche of, funding, another grant or whatever. I've spoke to them, like they do it like that. I think a lot of people do it like that right now. It's just one I know of. But yeah, I also think the glory days of, giant grants programs and everybody just like trying to pile into them. And there's a lot of people grant farming as well. Fairly simple projects who are like, they go from protocol. Like that's, I think all BDs, protocols as well have this like, like little indicator right now, like there's maybe a tick box. Is this project grant farming? And that's something you really want to be aware of, because there's a lot, they go to one ecosystem, they get 20K, and then they go to another one, they get 20K, and you kind of see it. Like they're quite obvious to spot, and like that's kind of bad behavior. So yeah. But yeah, okay. So the other big thing that's been touched on, and well, there's loads of ways to dice it, hackathons. What's the good, the bad, and the ugly, or like what's good with hackathons? There's obviously, again, a place where you can easily spend loads of money and basically get nothing in return. But yeah, what do you think works at the minute? What isn't working?
So we've done 2 hackathons just this week. Smaller ones. We did the Monad and the Story one. 2 very different experiences. Which is good. It's always good to get different experiences working with different projects. But what we normally focus on, what our head of DevRel always focuses on, is not always being at the booth, but going and actually talking to hackers for, if it's a weekend hackathon, talking to them for 48 hours, finding what they want, why they've picked specific projects, what about those specific projects, did they like the docs at those specific projects, why did they like the docs at those projects, what didn't they like, what are we doing well, what could we improve on, Was the flow right? Was the developer journey correct? Well, getting as much feedback as possible. And then also when, you have, I don't know, 10 projects that are built on you in that time frame, when they come and present to you, actually recording that interview process, finding why they made specific decisions, what broke when they were trying to implement you. For example, for us, we have a storage part of our network. Why did they pick Filecoin? Why was that? How can we win you next time? What can we do better? Sometimes it's just as simple as our booth was closer, which you get at some hackathons, which is great. But, we've also had people say that they picked working with us because they like the shorts that we gave out. So you never know what you're going to get. But that's what I really like about hackathons, because, the way you said it's about talking to those first 100 devs. If you're in a room with, 1,300 devs for 48 hours, you can talk to a lot more than 100 of them, and you can figure out why they're making decisions. And if you actually act on that information afterwards, that's really great. As for how hackathons could improve in the future, again, I would like them to have some more structure rather than just, you used a small component of my network and now I have to give you $500. Like, you actually have to implement it to a certain point. Did you cross some milestones? Does your thing actually work? What is the funnel from being a hackathon project to being an ecosystem project? Because there's not a lot of pathways for people at hackathons. They could be a brilliant dev but have no commercial understanding at all. How do you take them from that funnel to the next funnel? What is that process? And I don't think that's massively clear from the people organizing the hackathons right now. And it would be great to see more of that from their side as well as the project side.
I'll take a different approach, and I think you touched on it a little bit actually, which is like the structure, and you'd like to see a different structure. So I actually like hackathons, but my take here is I don't think we need as many as we have, right? So
Yep.
I don't think we need like 10 hackathons this week. I haven't been to any of them, but I don't think we need them. So the reason why I say that is hackathons, like with anything else, is a tool. It's a tool in your toolkit. If you're going to build like a house, you always use the hammer every single time. You got to use everything else. And so with the structure point, I think what hackathons initially tried to address was pain points and problems of developers. How do you actually use your product and serve it as a solution so then the developers can use them and then hopefully build something interesting. If it's full production ready or not doesn't really matter, just like that whole closing the loop of trying to solve that problem, ideating, solving it, and then kind of repeating, right? Where I think it got out of hand is all of a sudden people were focusing on how can you do it without any sleep for 3 days? How can you do it by having an online portion? How can you do it with a rave in between? All these things, there's merit to them for sure. I'm not trying to like bag on any of these ideas, but I think where we got lost is we got lost with the problem statement. And I think when we started to talk to developers with whatever role I've had, I've done this at every single one for the most part, you start to understand, okay, well, yes, we have problems with the tech stack that we're dealing with, but we also have other problems. We don't know how to run a business. We don't know how to fundraise. We don't know how to market. So all of us probably have had those conversations with developers. We don't know how to relieve stress because this industry is so stressful that this is actually something that I think about all the time. And when we think about events, then so just bringing an Avalanche example, we thought about all those problems, and instead of actually having a hackathon, we tried to solve those. And we took experiments and risks on how do we actually create a zone where we actually have a speaking workshop where someone talks to us about public speaking, or the developers about public speaking. How do we actually bring them together and just... We had in Istanbul for DevConnect last year, it was one of the most popular activities we had. We had a lamp making session. The lamp making session was kind of weaved into actually, how do you actually solve this problem? You have all the parts, how you actually collaborate with each other. And then once you got from that, you were actually energized to then actually go to the sessions and actually listen to the talks, or go and meet other people to maybe do a little bit of BD and go out of your shell, because that was the icebreaker. And you're seeing that a lot in the industry. You have, I don't know, like the yoga rooms or like the silent meditations. Those are all great. And I would love to see more of that. And maybe going back to your point, there's a totally different model of hackathons that can exist that solves the problem that initially we were set out to solve, but also goes beyond to adapt with the times, because everyone is kind of maybe a little bit sick of the same type of model. So I don't really have the exact answer, but I think we should all try to experiment a little bit more, and hopefully we're doing the same as well on stage.
Well, it seems like, the model, like, you hack for 12 hours, you rave for 3 hours, and then you hack for another 12 hours. It feels like the marketers got way too involved in the hackathon process, and the developers weren't as involved in the planning process for that anymore. So the marketers are like, well, so we're going to do the exact same model. So it feels like we just need to put more devs actually backing the planning process for what a hackathon should be. Like, ask developers, what do you actually want to do at this thing? And like, please don't make me plan it. Like, you should tell me what you want. And then we try and aim to solve that problem again.
Yeah, and for its worth, I love raves, so there's nothing against raves, but I think where we're seeing a little bit of like the differentiation from that model, and I think a lot of companies are trying to experiment is like, how do we do this digitally? What are the ways we can actually engage developers? I think like the baseline was, again, like the hackathons, online 30-minute workshops, maybe like those incentivized quizzes. But then now you're seeing a little bit more. Now you're seeing a little bit like, hey, maybe we can actually collaborate on actual use cases. There's a lot of cross-functional or cross kind of company type endeavors that you're seeing, especially in the Ethereum space, that happened kind of behind closed doors back in the early days. And now it's much more out in the open. And you have marketers involved, you have developers involved. And so that's really, really cool. I think there's still a lot left to go. And yeah, I think those are some of the early kind of signs of the V2s of those kind of dev engagement models.
Yeah, and I mean, I might be wrong. Right? I'm also not a dev, but I think there's a perception sometimes in this industry that like what devs do, right? They sleep, they wake up in the morning, and they're like, right, I need to go and hack, right? And then like ETH Denver sometimes feels like there's a hackathon around every corner, and that like the devs are just going from hackathon to hackathon, and they're just hacking themselves to, maybe not to death, but they're really just, that's all they're doing is just hacking, and they don't do anything else. And they eat a little bit, maybe they're a bit raving, and then they hack. Right. And I think it's a bit maybe over the top that like that's all devs want to do. And like they've, we don't need to ask them anything else. Just to let them hack away. And obviously there's loads of protocols and loads of projects who do kind of want this. But it feels, yeah, as you said, like it's a bit over the top. Like, the main hackathon, the, Biddle Week and stuff. And there's some others. But I almost feel like we need to like curtail it a little bit because I would say if we look at events this week, how many events are about go-to-market? And go-to-market can be anything from marketing to fundraising to BD or whatever. How many events are about that? Like there's this, we're doing one, there's a handful. And then how many hackathons are there? And I know it's a dev conference, but I bet it's like 10 to 1. And like that just feels disproportionate based on like what we need for the industry, at least in my opinion. And I think, yeah, the other thing as well, like with hackathons is the money spent sometimes is just kind of like, I don't know, over the top. Like, I think there are fair amount of like companies, essentially sort of more, maybe they're event agencies who are sort of, farming sponsorships for hackathons. And in the end, like they, I don't know how much money they're making, but they might be doing quite well. And this, yeah, they've got 10 sponsors on a hackathon. Everybody's it's 50K because devs are expensive, right? Yeah. And yeah, it just seems a bit unnecessary. So I think like going back to like what is your ultimate goal? Like maybe actually doing like a mini accelerator online or just some kind of like digital thing with like a small group of founders would be like higher ROI than just piling into hackathons. But I do, they obviously serve a purpose. But yeah, I feel like we've lost our way a little bit. It's a bit like our general side events sometimes at conferences. Like, do we need 700? I don't know. But we're doing it. So okay.